Just like in every major profession, the executives in the music industry make mistakes. Sometimes they make really, really big mistakes. Then there are times where multiple labels make the same mistake, like rejecting a band that would come to be known as iconic or legendary. Almost every major rock band has been rejected at some point in their career from a record label. I even spoke to Vinny Fiorello from Less Than Jake, who mentioned that they were told to not quit their day job when they submitted their demo to Fat Records back in the 90s. Obviously, Less Than Jake went on to have some pretty good success with Dill Records, which later became Asian Man Records under Mike Park's vision, and then they signed to Capitol Records, Fat Records, and even over the course of their career to Warner. But this is sort of a common theme as well, in that a band gets passed on by a label and then later gets signed by them, or at least they get reapproached by them once they are doing bigger things. Now, while I love Less Than Jake, I wouldn't necessarily call them a household name. They are definitely punk and ska famous though. However, all the bands that I'm going to talk about today did make a huge splash and sold millions of records worldwide, and every last one of them were told that they didn't have what it takes to be successful. So what bands are deserving of making the top 5 times record labels rejected bands that became iconic list? Well, let's find out. Let's see who made the list. Well, I think I have to start here with the most obvious and most notable story about a major band being rejected, because a lot of people do already know the story, but if you're under 40, you may not have heard it before. So let's dive into the Beatles being rejected by Decca Records, which is one of the most famous instances of a missed opportunity in the entire music industry, not just in the rock genre. So let's take it back. In the early 1960s, the Beatles were a relatively unknown band making their way through the local clubs in Liverpool, England. But by 1961, they were looking for a record label to help them launch their career. Their manager, Brian Epstein, arranged an audition for them to meet with Decca Records on January 1st, 1962, New Year's Day. Probably no hangovers in the room, right? During the audition, the Beatles performed 15 songs, including both original compositions and cover songs. However, despite their what's been known as an energetic performance and undeniable talent, the executives at Decca Records, notably A&R, or artist and repertoire manager, Dick Rowe, ultimately decided to not sign them. There have been reports that suggest Rowe thought that guitar groups were losing their popularity. I'll get to his famous quote in a second. While others say that Decca felt that the Beatles' sound wasn't marketable enough. Notably, Dick Rowe famously remarked after the audition that guitar groups are on their way out, Mr. Epstein, in what has become one of the most infamous quotes in music history. Now, Dick Rowe actually said that he did not actually say that, and that actually came from a book from Brian Epstein saying that that's what actually Dick Rowe said to him. But, that is one of the most famous quotes in music industry history. The label allegedly followed that up by saying, quote unquote, the Beatles had no future in show business. And if somebody at Decca Records did say that, I would bet that they would have lost their job over the next few years. This decision by Decca Records is often cited as one of the biggest blunders in the music industry, given the Beatles' subsequent unprecedented success. During the same time of being rejected by Decca, Epstein actually approached EMI about signing the Beatles, and they too almost let the band slip through their fingers as 3 separate producers refused to record the Beatles. However, the Beatles finally did get signed with Parlophone Records, which was a subsidiary of EMI, under the guidance of producer George Martin, who had heard the Decca Records demo. Obviously, working with George Martin was kind of a match made in heaven. Their first single, Love Me Do, was released later in 1962, and the Beatles went on to become one of the most iconic, influential, and successful bands of all time, revolutionizing popular music and leaving an indelible mark on the culture worldwide. To top it off, once the Beatles decided to start putting their music on streaming service, well, they've also become one of the most streamed artists in the world, with several songs over 100 million streams on Spotify and other streaming services, obviously. And that's led by Here Comes the Sun, which has over 1 billion streams on just Spotify alone. So yeah, you could easily see how this was the biggest mistake in the history of the music industry, and EMI and Parlophone cashed in on that mistake. U2's Rejection by RSO Records is another well-known example of a band overcoming initial setbacks to achieve massive success. In the late 1970s, U2, then a young rock band from Dublin, was seeking a record deal to kickstart their career. In 1978, U2's manager Paul McGuinness sent a demo tape of the band's music to several record labels, including RSO Records, known for its roster of influential artists. RSO Records was a pretty well-known record label at the time. They had bands on their stable such as the Bee Gees, Eric Clapton, Cream, and they also served later and kind of during this time as a distributor for several famous soundtracks such as Fame, The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and Grease 2. Now, the record label that did pick up U2 was Island Records, but they weren't initially fond of U2 either. Founder Chris Blackwell has actually stated that he was not impressed with U2 from just their recorded music, and it wasn't until he saw them play a small club that he really considered even signing them. He was quoted in an interview with UltimateClassicRock.com in 2022 as saying, "In the case of U2, I was really impressed in this little club with maybe 17 people in it, and this man, very well dressed and very clearly a serious businessman. I thought, wow, well, if he's there to do this, you can see their drive and their passion for what they were doing." Despite both the RSO rejection and the initial setback with Island Records, U2 persevered and continued to perform live and build a following through their energetic and impassioned performances. The band initially put out a 3-song EP under CBS Records for just the Irish market. But when the band played a 2,000-seat venue at National Stadium in 1980, an A&R rep from Island Records was there and he offered them a contract. And Island Records would go on to produce the most popular albums in U2's catalog during the 1980s and 1990s. U2's breakthrough came with their third album, War, released in 1983, which featured the hit singles Sunday Bloody Sunday and New Year's Day. The album's success propelled U2 to international fame and earned them widespread recognition for their anthemic rock sound and socially conscious lyrics. Fortunately for Island Records, they didn't make that same mistake that Decca Records made with the Beatles, but I can't say the same for RSO Records, which essentially became a subsidiary of Polygram Records within just a few years of U2's rejection letter. U2's journey from rejection to superstardom serves as a testament to their resilience and proves that with hard work and the right attitude, not only can you make good things happen for yourself, you can also change people's perspective of you. Now, this is actually one of my favorite stories because Nirvana's been one of my favorite bands since I was a kid. Formed in Aberdeen, Washington in 1987, Nirvana developed into a rock trio with Kurt Cobain, Chris Novoselic, and eventually Dave Grohl becoming the kings of grunge, the slayers of pop, and the enders of glam metal. However, at the time, Nirvana wasn't very well known, and even Dave Grohl didn't know much about the band. Dave Grohl himself said he was a bit intimidated by the band until he met them, saying, "I remember being in the same room with them and thinking, what? That's Nirvana? Are you kidding? Because on their record cover, they look like psycho lumberjacks." I was like, what, that little dude and that big mother? In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the music industry was dominated by the long-haired, tight pants-wearing glam metal rock bands, and also pop acts like Madonna and Michael Jackson. And Nirvana's raw grunge sound initially faced resistance from many record labels, as it was a drastic change from what was popular at the time. Nirvana had initially signed a contract with Seattle indie label Sub Pop for $600 to record and release their first album, Bleach. But when the band felt that they could do better, they had to look to major labels, as other indie labels wouldn't likely be able to buy out their contract with Sub Pop. Novoselic actually mentioned in a retrospective interview, I think it was last year or the year before, with Rick Beato on YouTube, that he and Cobain drove nonstop. As he says, Kurt and I in this van, and we would sleep in this parking lot, and then we would go to our meetings. No one was really impressed with us. We didn't really have the looks or anything. We were just kind of shaggy, and people would think, who is this tall, weird guy? Despite all the rejections, Nirvana's reputation in the underground continued to grow, especially after their explosive performances on the indie circuit. Eventually, their breakthrough came when Geffen Records A&R executive Gary Gersh saw them perform in Seattle in 1990 and expressed interest in signing them. Nirvana wasn't fully sold on Geffen Records, though. The band actually wasn't really convinced until they were recommended to sign with Geffen Records after getting advice from Susan Silver, who happened to manage Soundgarden and Alice in Chains at the time. Their second album, Nevermind, was released in 1991, propelled by the success of the lead single Smells Like Teen Spirit, you probably heard it, and it became a cultural phenomenon, selling millions of copies worldwide and catapulting Nirvana to mainstream fame. The success of Nevermind not only transformed Nirvana into one of the most iconic bands of the 1990s, but also helped popularize the grunge movement and alternative rock genre. The album's impact on music and popular culture remains significant to this day, cementing Nirvana's place in music history despite their tragic end with Kurt Cobain's untimely death in 1994. I'm sure there are more than a couple of industry executives in LA that had kicked themselves in their own asses for being so hung up on the looks of Nirvana as opposed to their actual appeal. I guess it really is an example of the classic advice, never judge a book by its cover. Now, this one's a little bit different because it's not just about a band actually being rejected. It's also about a band rejecting a major label. Radiohead's journey to success actually kind of was hindered at the start, including a bit of a rejection from EMI. You know, obviously that's a bit of a decision that would later seem short-sighted given the band's massive impact on the music industry. But let's take it all the way back to the beginning. The band formed in Oxfordshire, England in 1985, and the band was initially called On a Friday. The name was later changed on a suggestion by their record label. And the band has actually consisted of the same 5 members the entire time as far as I'm aware. Tom York, Johnny Greenwood, Colin Greenwood, Ed O'Brien, and Philip Selway. By 1987, the band decided to take their demos that they had put together over to Island Records, who actually gave them an offer to sign a deal. Island Records was on the ball on this one. But the band actually turned down the offer for various reasons, including most of them wanted to go away to college. Now let's fast forward a couple years later, and Radiohead's now preparing to release their debut album, Pablo Honey. They sought a record deal to support its promotion and distribution. EMI, which was one of the UK's largest and most prestigious record labels, obviously they were the record label of the Beatles, had initially rejected signing Radiohead, and instead they put them on their subsidiary label, Parlophone, the same one that the Beatles started on. As one staff member named Carol Baxter said in a New York article, "At first I had to hide my Radiohead paperwork behind the Tina Turner and Queensrÿche files because my boss thought I was wasting my time. Then the call came in from Israel, actually, saying that the band had a hit." Even though EMI didn't completely reject Radiohead, they did sign him on a sub-label, there was a sentiment that EMI seemed to believe that Radiohead was never going to be commercially successful. In fact, Pablo Honey was released in 1993, featuring Creep as its lead single. The song was initially received with pretty mediocre favor. So were the follow-up singles, Anyone Can Play Guitar and Stop Whispering. It seemed like EMI was actually right for putting Radiohead on their indie label, but then something happened. Creep actually gained traction internationally, particularly in the United States, where it became a hit single. They were actually more successful in Israel and the United States than they were in the UK. And it makes sense because the song fit into the young anti-pop demographic and got a re-release for international audiences in 1993. It wasn't until Radiohead's subsequent albums, particularly The Bends in 1995 and OK Computer in 1997, that the band's critical and commercial acclaim skyrocketed. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard the album, but OK Computer is by far my favorite Radiohead album, and it definitely earned them widespread recognition that cemented their status as one of the most innovative and influential bands in modern music. EMI's lack of enthusiasm of Radiohead serves as a reminder that record labels don't always recognize the potential of groundbreaking artists, and success can often come from unexpected places. Radiohead's resilience and commitment to their artistic vision ultimately paid off, leading to a career that has reshaped the landscape of alternative and experimental rock music. And maybe the craziest twist in this whole saga is when Radiohead and EMI entered into contract renegotiations after their 6th album deal ended, and EMI couldn't make the band happy. There were rumors that the band wanted a $10 million advance, and EMI was not going to do it. So Radiohead actually released their 7th album, In Rainbows, on their own website with a pay-what-you-want structure. Radiohead went on to sell 1.75 million physical copies of In Rainbows and roughly 50,000 digital copies. This was back when streaming was just kind of getting started. And that reportedly came out to around $18 million in sales, which the band didn't have to share with a record company at all. Obviously, their fame at the time definitely helped launch the album, but it goes to show you that sometimes the best bet is to bet on yourself. Now, this one is probably the most blatant rejection by major labels to not sign a band that later became iconic. Linkin Park was an iconic alternative rock band. In fact, I still believe that they still are active. They just don't have Chester Bennington anymore. And they faced their fair share of rejection from record labels before achieving widespread success. The band formed in Agora Hills, California in 1996, consisting of members Mike Shinoda, Brad Delson, Dave Farrell, and Rob Burden and Joe Hahn. They obviously later on added Chester Bennington. In their early years, Linkin Park struggled to secure a record deal. It has been reported that the band was rejected over 40 times by different labels at the time. The rejections likely stemmed from the band's eclectic style, which blended aggressive rock with elements of rap and electronic music, making it difficult for some labels to categorize them with existing genres. Things actually got to the point where the band knew something had to change, and that's when an attorney named Scott Harrington actually suggested Chester Bennington join the band to complement Mike Shinoda's vocals. In an interview with the PRP.com, Jeff Blue, an A&R executive at Warner Brothers Records, who recognized the band's potential early on, mentions what the first impressions of Bennington were, saying, "Chester left his own birthday party to lay down vocals to the tracks I had overnighted him. By the time I got back to Los Angeles from South by Southwest, I had a demo tape from Chester. What I heard floored me. Every crack of his voice had a story to tell. It was iconic, genuine, vulnerable, urgent, beautiful, and it hit you in the gut. I immediately called Brad and Mike and told them I was flying Chester out to Los Angeles. He then basically called up every label rep he could, and the band auditioned in person for A&R reps, with Warner Brothers eventually signing them to the label in 1999. Now, with Warner Brothers Records label support, Linkin Park released their debut album Hybrid Theory in 2000. And for those who just don't know, Hybrid Theory was actually the previous name of the band. The album was a smash hit, commercial success propelled by hit singles like In the End and Crawling. Linkin Park's subsequent albums, including Meteora and Minutes to Midnight, further solidified their status as one of the most successful and influential bands of their era. Their unique sound, emotional lyrics, and powerful live performances earned them a devoted global fan base and critical acclaim. The story of Linkin Park's rejection by record labels before finding success serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by aspiring artists in the music industry. Now, Linkin Park did have an unwavering commitment to their artistic vision that ultimately led them to become one of the defining bands of the early 2000s. Whether you're a fan of their music or not, you can't deny the success of the band and the hard work they put in. They became a creative force on their own merit. So much so that when the label tried to turn the band into a Chester Bennington's kind of solo project where the rest of the band was going to be made insignificant, Bennington reportedly told the label to go f*** themselves. That's the show for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you learned anything or liked what you heard on the show today, please show us some support and subscribe to this channel and like, comment, and share this video with a friend or put it up on social media. I hate to keep asking, but without those small actions, the YouTube bots pretty much ignore us. Putting out these episodes is a lot of work, and if you want to show your appreciation, please consider purchasing some of our musical accessories or some of our merch from our store at poweredbyrock.com. You can read our blog and follow us in the links below as well. Those are the plugs, and that's all I have. I'll see you soon for the next episode. Until then, rock on.
Supposed to be easy is